Well, I want to welcome you first to the Transcendent Minds podcast and tell us a little bit about your background, because I know that, we talked about your fascinating journey, because I know you were the son of a High Court judge in Edinburgh, and then you became ordained in the Western community of the Theravada Forest Tradition, and eventually you were teaching contemplative studies. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background, and bring the audience in so we can know a little bit more about you.
I was born into quite a cultured family, I guess. My father, as you mentioned, was a High Court judge. My mother did ceramics. They were all into the arts. There was a sort of growing interest in the Eastern philosophy, I guess, in my family as my parents grew older. I experienced a divorce at the age of 13, so I went through the pain of that. So that was, the first sort of major kind of event in my life, I suppose. And my mother then sort of became increasingly interested in sort of yoga traditions, Buddhist traditions, meditation traditions. And so there's all that sort of literature around. And she used to go to encounter groups in the 70s when they were a big thing. Yeah, so I used to get sort of encounter group leaders coming in, pressing my muscles and stuff like that to sort of do Reiki and whatever on me. So yeah, I grew up in that sort of environment. But if I look back on my childhood, I think I always had a curiosity about the universe. What is it? Right back from very, very early on. In fact, one of my earliest memories was of someone talking about meditation on television. And they were talking about how it's all about purple light and everything. I mean, it was actually not very insightful, but I do remember. It was very interesting to me that I remember that very vividly, whereas I don't remember really anything else from that period. So I don't know. I think I came in hardwired or programmed in some way for, for contemplative life. So, I went through conventional education. I went to the Edinburgh Academy. It was a terrible, terrible environment for me. It was a very painful experience, really. And then I went into the visual arts. I started to study photography. And it was while doing photography, I really got into the whole dynamics of seeing. And I began to notice through really looking at the world that I was beginning to sense something in matter, basically, that I hadn't really noticed before, a kind of quality of luminosity in objects. And that really started to be what I was searching for in my photography. And if you saw my early photographs, you'd sort of see these sort of quite high contrast images of rocks and trees and things that, where there's this sense of light somehow emanating out of objects. And that was a sort of indication, I think, of something that was, going to kind of grab me in the future. I also started to have sort of early, I don't like to use the word mystical experiences, but I was having some unusual experiences. In particular, I was getting a felt sense of silence, incredible felt sense of silence in busy places. I would be in a busy place and I would just feel this presence of a quality of silence and stillness that seemed to be in the foreground, that put everything else, all the activity, into the background. And it seemed more real in some way than all the activity, because it had a quality about it where it felt like it had been there before all of this had arisen, and it would remain untarnished as it was when all this had passed. And so, yeah, I was beginning to sort of have those experiences, wasn't really sure what they were about. Another thing I've mentioned in other podcasts that, maybe of interest to people was I had this habit as a child of asking myself, who am I? And then looking to see who I was. and then getting this shock when there was a discovery that I couldn't find that me that I was looking for. There was no discoverable core of meanness that I could grasp onto. And then I'd get this sort of electric shock that would go through my body, which I kind of think now was a sort of defensive mechanism because it was just an insight I couldn't integrate. But for some reason, I kept going back to it and doing it to myself again and again. I just, I had that curiosity. So then I think when I was in my very early 20s, around 2021, I ended up going on my first meditation retreat. And on that retreat, completely uninvited, without any prior knowledge of that such a thing existed, I had a very significant Kundalini experience, which was kind of mind-blowing. I mean, it felt life-threatening in a sense, but because at the same time it felt so alive, I was willing just to go with it, because it was like an injection, a magnification of a force of aliveness that was almost, it was too big for my body to actually hold. So it kind of...
Can you because you've mentioned Kundalini, a Kundalini experience, can you explain what that is for listeners who don't know what that is and how it differs from other types of spiritual awakenings?
Well, essentially, this is something we all share. There is something huge inside all of us. We can sense it. It's not unique to me. It's something that we share. There's something huge within us. Now, it is quite intimidating, so we have various ways of managing how we feel about that. It's quite anxiety inducing because it feels so enormous. We don't really know what to do with it. So Kundalini really is when that force breaks through and comes into the foreground. That electricity of aliveness, it's a force of nature. It's Holy Spirit in Christian terminology. It's holy wind in Navajo Indian terminology, is cosmic electricity in Theosophical Society terminology. It's a dragon power. It's a force of aliveness. It's our vital force breaking through in such a way that it overwhelms our normal systems of control or managing it. And it can present itself at such a scale that, it's a glimpse, but I was not, as I said, able to integrate in any way that force at the time. What it did was it alerted me to its presence, and it did kind of blow my mind a little bit. I didn't go insane, but I went into a very heightened state of consciousness. Let's call it transformational space for quite a long period of time. So I remember, we went to a pool table, and I was playing these incredible shots because I could just see everything so clearly. I could see, how to take the shot and pop the ball. So it's like I kind of wasn't missing. I had this all sorts of other intuitive sort of capacities at the time.
And are there common symptoms or experiences people might have during a Kundalini experience or awakening?
Yeah, well, I've talked on this before. I'm kind of reticent about using the word Kundalini because it is quite exotic, and it immediately creates a division between those who have had a Kundalini experience and those who haven't. And that's a division I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable with, because it's, as I say, it's a force of aliveness, and all of us often intuit it. I mean, all forms of creativity, real creativity, that is, are a form of downloading, or where we're kind of electrified by a force of nature that is greater than the conventional sense of self. So the conventional sense of self, in a sense, recedes when we start channeling clarity, creativity, innovation, things that are new and fresh and undiscovered, and that's kind of what we love, that discovery of the new, and all of that is kind of Kundalini. We see it in movies, you know, the Incredible Hulk, in a sense, you know, these movies like Star Wars and all the Marvel movies, they're full of references to this force. You know, Mr. Smith in The Matrix, finally, you know, when Neo works out how to kill him, he bursts into this, he re-emerges back into this, he shatters and re-emerges back into this light. You know, it's something that we all actually know of. We just live in a culture that's forgotten how to notice or make sense of it or cultivate it or understand our association with it. But we have references to it in our language when we say, you know, this person's as bright as a button, or they light up the room. You know, there are people like that. All forms of charisma are in a sense, expressions of that force working through an individual. Now, because some of us struggle to individuate and take responsibility for it, then we sometimes look to others to carry it for us. And these people often we call stars. So we elevate certain people who carry that force, have integrated it to some extent, have that luminosity, that creativity, that genius. And instead of us accessing it ourselves, we access it through association with something outside of ourselves. And so, you know, it's going on all of the time. It's accessible to all of us. So I don't want to imply that it's something unique to me that other people don't
No,
have.
absolutely. I think that, you know, any kind of work, especially shadow work, and working on lighting up your own darkness takes time, takes an investment in oneself. You've got to play the long game. It's tough. It's not an easy road because people want quick fixes. So I think that, you know, the body has its own apothecary, and we can heal ourselves. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is that, and I know you spoke about this, but could you elaborate on the mystical experience that you had at the age of 19, and how did that lead you to be ordained in the Western community of the Theravada Forest Tradition?
Theravada Forest Tradition. Well, look, I mean, I emerged from this retreat different, and I emerged from this retreat experiencing and accessing an intensity of life force that, you know, I had no education about. There was no points of reference really in the culture or in the society, in my family or friends or teachers. Nobody really had a clue. I went to see psychologists, psychotherapists, and I knew that they were completely and utterly clueless. So I started, you know, looking out for help, basically. I mean, I didn't want to have to handle all this on my own and make sense and meaning out of it on my own. And luckily, the Edinburgh Buddhist Society was a fantastic Buddhist society. I mean, you know, it used to fill up theaters. They got such great guests in. We got fantastic Tibetan tulkus and High Lamas, all sorts. So, you know, I was pretty much religiously going there. And it was one of those classes that I met this young monk, Western monk called Ajahn Cha, in his 30s, incredibly handsome, ex-Marine, ex-US Marine, and, you know, sort of old hippie kind of guy. And I just immediately felt attracted, magnetized to this guy, because I knew he had a quality about him that I needed. Something was visible as a result of his training. He also had a quality of luminosity and wisdom about him that I'd not encountered in Westerners before. And so I immediately went down to the monastery. There happened to be a festival day that weekend. I went down there, and then there was a whole bunch of other guys just like him, young Westerners. And I just saw, you know, there's something here that, you know, I've never seen before. I thought, I've got to find out what's going on here. And basically at the age of my 22nd birthday, I arrived at the monastery to ordain. And so, yeah, I ordained and stayed for 15 years. underwent quite an intense training.
And can you explain for listeners who don't know what the Theravada, is it
Theravada.
Theravada?
Theravada.
Theravada.
Yeah.
Right, what the Theravada Forest Tradition is, and how does it differ from other Buddhist traditions?
Okay, well, Buddhism's kind of divided up into several schools. The simplest division is Southern School and Northern School. So the Theravada tradition has its roots in the earliest form of Buddhism. So the tradition I was in actually goes all the way back to the time of the Buddha, and it pretty much has followed, without adding or subtracting very much, the tradition established in those very early times. So the Theravada tradition is the oldest of all the traditions, in some ways the most conservative, certainly the oldest. The other schools, like the Tibetan schools, incorporated aspects of Bon tradition, incorporated aspects of Taoist traditions as well from China. So a lot of these traditions evolved and developed, adding other skillful means and approaches according to the cultures they were founded in, such as Zen tradition, which is Japanese Buddhism, incorporated some of the values and ways of the samurai. So, each tradition, in a sense, has in time incorporated parts from the cultures that they moved into, whereas the Theravada tradition of all of them has remained the most unchanged. So that's a weakness and a strength. Depends how.
What drew you to that particular path?
Sorry, what attracted me to it?
No, what drew you to it? Because I know you mentioned the luminosity that this gentleman was beaconing out, which is obviously a transmissive force. And it makes me wonder about, homo luminosity or homo luminous, if you like. But what attracted you? What drew you to this particular path?
An affinity. People have different affinities. Who knows why? Maybe they're built up, through a series of lifetimes. I don't exactly know. I just felt an affinity, certainly an affinity with the people. And that affinity still remains very, very strong. It's almost like, finally, I found my family, find my tribe. It's kind of like there was something very familiar about these people. And there was a very deep, and remains to this day, a very deeply felt sense of connection to them. So I think also what attracted me was the recognition that, I needed disciplined. I was a big softie, bit of a mama's boy. I'd never really, I went to a public school which had discipline, etc., but I never really had any proper spiritual discipline or spiritual training. So there was a very clear discipline and training there. And there was just an incredible clarity that I found about the teaching. It seemed very direct. It was, of all the schools, it was the most rooted in learning to trust the actual phenomenon of your experience, direct experience, without the ornamentation and incrustation of too much additional sort of ideology or scripture or anything. It's basically saying, look at your body. You've got a body, look at your body. You've got eyes, look at the experience of seeing. You've got ears, understand the experience of hearing. So it had this naturalness about it, natural sense of directness about it. And I still believe that these things are true. I mean, to me, at this point, I find my contemplative life gives me access to the highest beauty that I believe exists. To me, the Dharma is the highest beauty. There is no higher beauty, and I don't believe anyone will ever find a higher beauty. Now, that's just a pure abstraction for the majority of people, because most people just don't know how to access it. But having said that, look around. How many homes have you seen with a Buddha statue in them? They're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. People sense something in Buddha statues. that they find incredibly attractive. They don't perhaps know why they find it so attractive. They don't perhaps know how to access what it is they sense in the Buddha statue. But nevertheless, I'm noticing, just walking around little villages in Devon and everything, the number of Buddhas there are sitting in people's windows and things. It's triggering a recognition in them of something, some potential that they can sense within that they want an association with. So they buy the statue, bring it into the home, and enjoy its presence.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And can you explain again for listeners who don't understand what the Dharma is?
Well,
in simple terms.
Simple terms, Dharma is, in Christianity, you've got the idea of sin, okay? Okay, so it's been a bit debased, and we think of sin as being, dirty and evil, but really, sin really means just to miss the mark, to not hit the bullseye. I mean, life is a mystery. How did we get here? Who are you? What's your destiny? Where are you going? What the hell is actually going on? Nobody really knows most of the time. So the Dharma is basically saying that if you don't miss the mark, if you come into alignment, if you attune to life as it actually is, that is the phenomenon, if you start to notice and experience the phenomenon of life as it actually is, without all the distortions that we inflict upon our experience, because that's basically what we're up to. We're just not getting a clear picture because there's just so much confusion going on. When the confusion drops away and you experience life absolutely directly, it reveals its depth, it reveals its true nature, it reveals itself as you realize, you recognize, you experience the laws of nature as they are, and in the experiencing of them, you become awakened or enlightened to the nature of things in their entirety. So that is really what the Dharma is. So the reason it's not understood or experienced is because of a word we have in the tradition called avijja, or ignorance. Now, ignorance has nothing to do with the conventional sense of acquired knowledge. Ignorance has to do with the idea of when you only see the top layer of the cake and you don't see the depth. Now, we're in an incredible position as human beings. If you think about this, when you see your body with your eyes, it looks like an object from the outside. I mean, you could go to Madame Tussauds and stand to a waxwork of yourself, and from the outside, someone might not be able to tell who's the real person, So from the outside, we appear on the surface to just be an object. But we have this incredible ability to turn our attention, our energy and attention around, and look also to the inside. And then when you turn to the inside of the body, you discover from the inside, it's a completely different dimension. In fact, if you close your eyes and look to the inside of your body, you discover there is no body there. In fact, in terms of outline, boundary, you can't say really as a sensation. And when you experience the body as a sensation, you can't say whether it's big or small, up or down, round or square. It's got much more feeling of space or ether or vapor. It's much more vaporous. It's full of atmospheres, all sorts of atmospheres. And then there are these things called thoughts going through our minds. So thoughts are things, just like our body, they're things. But if we just see the surface of the thing, then we're experiencing the thought in ignorance. But if you experience the thought without ignorance, then you see through the appearance into the essence, just as you can see through the appearance of your body from the outside. Turn your attention, you can experience the essence directly. Same with sensations. From the outside, it feels like pain, pleasure, anxiety, and they have a solidity about them. We can feel very compressed and jammed up by these sensations because we're just seeing them from the outside. But with contemplative seeing and inquiring investigation, you break through to the essence of the inside as well. then when you get to the inside, everything starts to converge on this incredible inner potential that we have for love and compassion and wisdom, basically, and the immeasurables, you might say. So, you know, the potential that we see in a Buddha is what are we seeing? We're seeing serenity. We're seeing we're seeing a bringing together of the inside and out. When you look at the eyes of a good Buddha statue, they're looking back in, but they're also looking back out. So they balance both inside and out. You're seeing that stillness, that composure, that sense of okayness, no matter what the circumstances are. And I would encourage anyone with a Buddha statue, just walk up to the Buddha statue and start telling it about your life, sort of saying, you know, I'm feeling really down today, and see what comes back. So what's happening is here, I think there's a word actually that encapsulates all of this. And this is really the point, really, I think, of everything I want to say. It's all about, to say it's all about love is fatuous, because, you know, that can just mean anything. But it's really about intimacy. And one way of looking at the word intimacy is the idea of intimacy. So intimacy. If you stand in front of a Buddha statue and tell it about your problems, whatever, in some sense, you're seeing into it, but it will in return see back into you. And you'll kind of get this intersubjectivity beginning to happen with an inanimate, seemingly inanimate object. But what you're beginning to do is start to see and experience not just the exterior, but something else that is carried in the statue, which is really probably the spirit of the Buddha, and in some when the statue is well made, well balanced.
Yeah, I think that well, we're taught to only see what we teach ourselves to see, and
Yeah.
you know, on a physical level, you know, if I look at a tree, I'm looking at the 1/3 of that tree. The other 2/3 are under the ground. So there's a 2/3, 1/3 principle at play. In
Sure.
likewise fashion, you know, your body, you know, my arm, for instance, I can only move 2/3 of it at one time. My finger, I've got 3 parts to it, but I can only be in 2/3 of it at one time. And I think that's the same thing with conscious, semi-conscious, and unconscious.
Sure.
Right. So when you're asleep, you're in your unconscious and semi-conscious. When you're awake, you're in your conscious and semi-conscious, even though the subconscious is running the show most of the time. And I know that trying to quieten the mind, I know mindfulness is now this huge buzzword, and meditation, you know, which in my view has been stripped out of the Eightfold Noble Path and commercialized. So what I'm interested in asking you is, can you describe your personal meditation practice within the context of this tradition, of the forest tradition, and how does it differ from other forms of meditation?
Wow, big question. I mean, you know, my meditation practice is fundamentally to do with the cultivation of wisdom. I'm not looking to meditation practice to get into states particularly. I can access stillness quite readily as a result of all the years of practice that I've done. So, you know, I can just sort of tune in like that. So I can access, in a sense, a contemplative attitude, sitting down, standing up, walking, lying down, whatever. So in that sense, to me, that's meditation practice. I don't confine it just to the idea of, you know, sitting on the floor, you know, with my thumbs together. I find, for me, the whole contemplative direction just so powerful, so useful, but you have to develop the skill. I mean, it just doesn't come by accident. I've been trained, and that training is not readily available or even that well understood by the majority of people, even mindfulness teachers. I don't think many mindfulness teachers really have a great depth of understanding about this tradition, to be honest. Most of them are teaching it in a very mechanistic way. The depth of this tradition is mind-boggling, really. And it's often dismissed because it seems simple. I mean, when the Buddha was asked, what is it that I teach? He said, if asked what I teach, tell people I teach dukkha, dukkha nirodha. So that is suffering and the end of suffering, or compression and the end of compression, spaciousness, or being bound and being unbound, or being oppressed and being free, being in pain, being free from pain, etc., etc. It's all the same thing, but that twist, that gate where suddenly you go from, and that's basically what wisdom is, where you hit a wall that you feel you can't get past, you feel feeling maybe depressed or anxious or whatever, and then with that contemplative wisdom, you can go to the sensation. You go through all these different layers. It's very important we understand there's just so many layers. Look at your own body from the outside. If no one knew better and just saw your body, they'd have no clue what's going on the inside. But we all know how much is going on the inside, contrary to the appearance on the outside. So why wouldn't that apply to every other thing in existence, potentially? The chair you're sitting in, the desk you're leaning on, it's got an objective or external appearance, but has it got other dimensions to it as well? Has it got an inside going on as well, similar to the inside we experience? Now, we are obviously more complex, but when we trace the inside right back to the original condition or the original state or the unborn potential, then you begin to recognize that the desk also has that interior unborn potential as well. Everything is actually can be experienced as emerging from the source condition, and which is like a still forest pool, a kind of untainted and beautiful crystal pool. Now, what's going on is it's like drops in that pool. When you think or have a thought about yourself, it's just like a drop that drops in that pool, and then it ripples away gradually. And we don't notice what it merges into, but because there's another drop and then another drop, but they're all just rippling away, and the thoughts that we have, those ripples of sensation and feelings, it's just an artifact of the thinking mind, but it's not in any way definitive, and it's constantly being reabsorbed back to the source condition, which is this still forest pool. Every sensation we have, it's actually similarly creating certain number of ripples, but then it reabsorbs back into the still forest pool. Perhaps even the body itself is an object within this still forest pool, and it's going to return back to this source condition, the still forest pool, like a wave that returns back into the ocean. Maybe ocean is a better image for the body. So, my practice then is about continuously noticing that process. And the more you notice it, the more that still forest pool starts to, become your identity. It becomes your new identity. And it becomes, you could say, you start to experience, no doubt you've heard the word samadhi, that samadhi of the mind. Now, samadhi actually, as a word, is referencing the idea of a garland of flowers that are held together by a thread. So once you start seeing past the surface, which is when we just see the surface of things, that's avijja, that's ignorance, that's not understanding. Once you start then seeing the still forest pool from which all things, like waves, are temporarily emerging and then receding back into, then you find that thread that connects all things, that invisible thread of the source condition. So then you get this intersubjectivity, this where, you know, the tree penetrates into me and I penetrate into the tree, and we see or I experience that source condition from which we're both emerging fully. And that something, just an incredible joyful experience. There's all sorts of extras that come along as a result of becoming that porous, becoming that open to the totality of our existence. You know, this is a mysterious universe. You know, this, I don't think anyone can deny that. You know, 2 trillion galaxies in the visible universe, each galaxy with 400 billion stars in, you know, we're in this situation is big, you know, and there's stuff going on here that we need to grow into and become familiar with, because life as we know it is not enough. It's never going to be enough. The universe doesn't even let it stay enough. Life as you know it is going to change. It's certainly going to change when we die, you know, so we don't want to wait to die before we have a deeper appreciation of what's going on. So tracing everything back to this this unborn awareness that's full of intelligence, full of curiosity, tracing everything back brings about this experience of samadhi, because all things essentially at heart are in a state of samadhi, communion, stillness. You know, we're the only ones that are like fidgeting around. Trees are quite happy just being a tree. You know, they're not trying to be something other than they are. The floor is quite happy being the floor. It's not trying to be something other than it is. But we're different because we've got options, we've got choices, and we feel distanced from our potential. Now, that potential is like a vice. It's not going to let go. It wants to be realized. The universe is trying to enrich itself. We're trying to enrich ourselves. That's why we get married. That's why we do stuff. That's why we go on adventures. We're trying to enrich ourselves.
Yeah, something that I was struggling with in terms of the universe. The question I asked myself is, what's it in?
What's it in?
What's it in? Because it can't be nothing. There must be something that it's in. What's it in? And that's, you know, and that is probably a lifelong question to discover, to try and.
Yeah, but you're thinking just in terms, when you ask that question, of a physical or visible universe.
Just in its totality, like you're explaining how many trillions of galaxies.
Yeah.
Well, what's all that in?
You're just thinking though in terms of the visible universe. I mean, the characteristic of the interior space of our body, as I was saying, has this more etheric, vapor-like quality, but atmosphere-like quality. Let's call it space. I mean, just look at space. When I hear birds singing now, and I use them and I use that as a contemplative device, we have this saying in the tradition: in the seeing, there's just the seen; in the hearing, there's just the heard; in the tasting, there's just the tasted, you know, etc. In the feeling, there's just the felt. What does that mean? In the hearing, there's just the heard with a bird as an experience, as a contemplative experience. It is increasingly amazing to me as life goes on, just listening to bird song, because in the hearing, there's just the heard, the hearer disappears. But me as Mahesi, or as a point of resistance, or as an intermediary to the experience of hearing, becomes invisible. Even the sense of the ear as being the definitive instrument for hearing that bird song disappears, because the bird song then permeates through my entire body. It's almost like every cell of my body gets filled with that bird song as a sensation. It's very hard to describe this, but it fills the entire body as a sensation. That sensation, when you get past the surface and go to the interior nature of it, is boundless. It fills all of space. And how do I know it's all of space? Because there is no end to it. There's no end, discoverable end to that sensation. You just have to have confidence in the fact that that is actually the case and notice. There's no end to it. So it's simultaneously, it feels to me as if it fills the entire universe. So the entire universe is simultaneously got one tiny bird, which is located in a tree in Devon, but at the same time is filling itself infinitely. And so there is this dynamic going on. And actually it's expressed in the Buddhist tradition. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, or form is infinite, infinity is finite. And so there's this play going on, which is mind-blowing, but mind-blowing in a way, except it becomes normalized when you recognize, well, this is just the way it is, you know. But the experience of that infinity of birdsong means you feel full, completely full. So in that moment, there's no lack, there's no sense of absence, because that contemplative orientation is just so enriching, because that is fundamentally what the universe is seeking to enrich itself, in my estimation, enrich itself through the creation of multiple perspectives. And it's a constant processing of enriching, and also a constant process of removing avijja, of moving this ignorance, which is just seeing things in a single dimension, just seeing surfaces. And there is a teaching in the Theravada tradition, which is very rarely encroached on because it is so deep, it is so profound. I mean, even experienced teachers kind of veer away from it because it is very hard to understand. In my estimation, it's the greatest thing that's ever come out of a human being's mind, except no one's ever heard of it. It's called Paticca. It's called the 12 Links of Dependent Origination. And it does explain the steps of how things have come into being as they appear to being. And then when you reverse back, how everything ceases. So the idea of cessation is not disappearance, but the idea of cessation is the elimination of all parameters. And I mean, the bizarre thing about space, just physical space, if you think about it, is that point of space in front of your nose. How far, you know, where's the boundary between that point of space and the furthest point of space in the universe? I mean, or are they actually simultaneously finite and infinite at the same time? Is that if that's what's, I think that is actually what's going on. So when one of the things then that can cease is form itself, name and form. Do you want me to go have a stab at Paticca?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it makes me think that it's not an either or a both and. It's a spectrum. It's like looking at something on a spectrum. I mean, that's sort of my understanding of it, because just something I want to touch on before you go there is that there's this sort of mutual co-shaping that goes on, so that, if I'm out in nature, I may just be going for a walk, or, part of my meditation is walking and being mindful about my environment. But is the environment shaping me and I am shaping the environment?
Yeah.
And is that mutual co-shaping going on? So in likewise fashion, is the refinement and enrichment of the universe co-shaping what we do and how we do it? And is it working through that spectrum so that the universe starts to enrich and nutrify itself, and it's a two-way street.
What I'm saying is, when avijja exists, it's very monodimensional. You see the tree, you see the bench, you see the flower, and as you grow older, it starts to feel a bit like a prison, because it just seems like you're seeing the same thing all the time, and it's boring. It kind of starts to become boring. If you remove avijja, then what starts happening is, as it is with our bodies, there's layers and layers and layers that you can work through, and nobody knows how deep these layers go. In fact, I suspect that there's no limit, but I think the universe itself is discovering new depths and has an infinite capacity for depth. And that would make sense, because if it was finite, there'd be an end to it. And there's nothing more boring than a road that ends. It's the open road that never ends. That's what's incredibly enticing. That potential for infinite discovery. And I think that is actually the way things are wired. So when avijja goes, there's just so many layers, and that's what I'm finding. I'm not saying that I'm free from ignorance, but in my years of contemplative practice, as I've had those times and moments when ignorance has ceased to a degree, I've just been continuously discovering all these new depths, like the experience of birdsong, that then suddenly feels like the whole universe is just the song of that bird. And when you relax into it and let go into that experience, it is, well, you become accustomed to it in a way, because you kind of have to become accustomed to it, so you don't sort of close it down with a kind of reaction. But if you just relax into it, it's a magnificent and awe-inspiring experience. I mean, I do quite a bit of walking now. I began to notice I would pick up the tires of bicycles on the gravel on the road, and I'd start feeling them through my whole body. And it was kind of like they just fill all of space, and I kind of know that there was a bike coming way before I actually saw it. I sort of felt it, and my body at that moment felt transparent in terms of its boundary, its limits, felt completely transparent. And so what was happening is, layers were being removed. The layer of my body as an object, my ears as a sense organ, etc., where everything becomes boxed in and isolated as an object. That's what I'm saying. Avijja removes othering, and that when that othering is removed, the interconnectedness, the interpenetration really begins to happen. And that word interpenetration is quite interesting, because it sort of has a sexual connotation, and there is a sort of eroticism that associated with this. There's enlightenment factors such as piti, bliss, that you pervade your whole body with. And the Buddha just said, you've got to circulate this bliss, this well-being through your body, like dissolving bath soaps into a bath. So because that's removing the layers of separation. The separation between you and the desk, you and the cup, you and the flower. It's removing all these layers, and then you start to get this interpenetration where the sort of miraculous multi-layeredness of all things starts to be experienced directly. And in that constant exchanging, that constant interpenetration, there is this kind of illumination, this bliss, this sense of fullness that then removes or starts to diminish all the bullshit that we get up to, which is mainly to do with greed, hatred, and delusion, which is our reaction to not fulfilling this felt sense of potential. So we're all entitled, we all have birthright to feel fully alive, but if we're not informed about how to do it right, we're going to start making mistakes, errors in judgment, we're going to target misguided things. We're going to start thinking it's out there, it's something other, it's in the thing itself. We start thinking everything, you know, it's in the car, it's in that person, you know, I want that car, I want that person, I want that house, like that guy in the Tolkien. So that kind of wants it or wants to get rid of it. It's got to go, you know, that's bad. It's got to go. It wants to kill it, get rid of it. Those are the two fundamental forms of desire. Or the third and final one would be, I want a sensation. I want to see something, I want to hear something, I want to eat something. So the alternatives, if you can't get past the surface, yeah, you're still going to want to feel alive for sure, but you're going to then start seeking out things and create addictions, which are alternative centers of aliveness, you know.
Well, and you know, the structure of our society is predicated on an education system that wants us to fulfill an economic imperative,
yeah,
so that we can consume, we can get that top job, we can earn those six figures, we can, and then, you know, your life, if life is just about eating, drinking, sleeping, having sex, sensation, desire, greed, and then losing consciousness after 70 or 80 years, then there's a sense of nihilism about that in the way that I see it, because it's like, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point of just doing that?
As one teacher said, the alternative to spiritual life is everything to do with money, food, and sex.
Right. So what are some of the, I know you were going to touch on one of the teachings, but before you go there, what are some of the key teachings of the Theravada Forest Tradition, and how do they apply to everyday life?
Yeah, well, look, it's incredibly pragmatic, actually. I mean, you know, there's so much to touch on. I'm not sure we'll get through it all in this podcast, but, you know, the actual fundamental core is the body itself. This is the source of all our pain, all our confusion, all our misunderstanding. We don't know what it is. As I say, you know, with ignorance, we just think it's a monodimensional entity. You know, the body's me. You know, the body is definitive of who, what I am. You know, I'm the body is me. And if you think that, then I guarantee you're going to suffer. You know, that's an unsustainable position, because your body's going to die and you don't want to die. I mean, that's not a particularly attractive proposition. So if you're identified with the body on its own, we are in serious trouble, and there's no point in even discussing anything else. But the message of the Buddhist tradition is, through contemplative work, really, you can make literal shifts in consciousness where you discover that you are not, in fact, the body. You're something else. When you experience that directly, then, you know, like a wave that recedes back into the ocean, you don't actually die. If you know you're the ocean, then the disappearance of the wave is much less terrifying than if you just identified as the wave and have no notion of your destiny. So, you know, I had a friend who happened to be with a famous Indian saint, actually, called Bede Griffiths. As a Westerner, became a Hindu, kind of Hindu Christian. He sort of synthesized the two things together. And they were there while he was dying. And she was describing how it was just such an incredible experience being there, because this is a person who knew how to die. And he practiced all his life dropping the body and mind, which is essentially what meditation is. It's seeing beyond the body and mind. So she said there's just this incredible sense of his consciousness becoming more and more luminous as he was dying. And in a sense, the body, I would say, was being experienced as more and more distant, more and more invisible, as the foundation of his experience. And so it was no doubt a very amazing and enlightening death, because a good death is a death where you can die in that way, where you're fully prepared, and it's not actually a death, it's a continuation of the process of enrichment. And not many people can face death in that way, whereas we have this notion of deathlessness in the tradition, and that is realizable. That is a real thing, you know. And so being a human being is seen as transitional. You know, this is not our true home. It's like we're on holiday, but we're not really at our true home. And just like when you are on an actual holiday, you sort of miss your home. You enjoy the holiday, but there's always a kind of stress associated with it. You know, because it's not your stuff. It's not really where you live. And then when you get home, there's a sense of sort of relief. Well, right now we're kind of in this holiday state. We're not really in our true home. But when you know where your true home is, then that you've got a great advantage in your very resource then to meet your life in a way that the majority of people aren't able to meet. And when you have that resourcing, it makes you're better. If you can imagine, if we all had that resourcing, the society would be different. It would be
Well, and I think that, you know, in the body's always in the present. It's the mind that can be in the future or the past. It can be everywhere, but your body's always in the present. And when I consider that, you know, what is this self-adaptive organism, I realize that I'm part of a system that's to do with the evolution of the human race.
Yeah.
And it's more carnal than energized. That's the way it feels from a carnal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I can only head that way. I can only head towards being energized by the vine of organic life. Because as you say, this is like a boot camp.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like it feels like we're something that is preordained. It seems like we want to purvey that which is immortal because it's a transition point.
That's the opportunity. The opportunity is for, if the body is form, okay? So if what I'm saying about form and emptiness being in this dance, then the vast majority of us are just experiencing ourselves as form. We're not experiencing the dance of form and emptiness, emptiness and form. It's that dance of form as emptiness, emptiness as form, that is the absolute, you know, rocket fuel for enrichment. And so we have that opportunity to understand that the body, as experienced in its totality, is a lot more than just the form. There's all these dimensions of sensation, there's space, there's luminosities, there's all sorts of stuff going on in there. Dreams, you know, astral travel, you name it. There's, like I say, multiple dimensions, some of which we've never probably even discovered yet. Fractal, you could say, like a fractal that just keeps revealing deeper and deeper and deeper layers. And so, yes, we've all got that opportunity. If we've got a body, then we have that opportunity. Now, some of us are going to take it to one degree or another. Some of us are going to actually bypass the work of doing it properly and use drugs and things to try and access it when we pay a price for that. You know, some of us, we're all doing our own different forms of research. You know, if you're a sex addict, you're going to learn something. If you're a money addict, you're going to learn something. You know, if you're an alcoholic, you're going to learn something. We're all doing our own forms of research, but when we go down the wrong path, we're finding that full sense of aliveness that we all desire most. If we go down the wrong path, eventually, out of compassion, nature has ensured that that path will fail. You know, so they'll give us a certain amount of time to explore it, but yeah, it will begin to unwind and unravel and fail and then then you'd be offered a chance for a reset. It's like, okay, you tried that enough, reset. If we refuse to reset, then we die, and then we're reset that way. we can't stop that reset from happening. So,
well, I've found that, you know, in a way, throughout my life, and I've seen it in others when I'm coaching others, is that there's almost a universal tap
yeah,
to change, because that's nature's way. Those symptoms are nature's way that something has to change.
yeah,
And when they don't, if they're not a hungry respondee to that tap, then they get slapped.
yeah,
And it's almost like they get hit by a cosmic 2x4.
yeah. I mean, it has to be said, it's the initiation into pain is, I have learned most by initiations into pain. And I've had a good number of them. I mean, we don't need to recount all the instances, but you know, I've done, and I've mentioned this recently in a post I made somewhere. You know, you do all this sort of inverted commas spiritual preparation, all these practices, you know, yoga, blah blah blah, meditation, blah blah blah. And I mean, I reached a point in the monastery, in fact, where I knew there was like this. I actually remember the moment I turned around to this nun and I just said, "There's something wrong here." You know, we were at this big public talk in London, and the community was there. And I'm telling you, we were all lit up like a Christmas tree. Everyone noticed us. You know, we were a bunch of young celibates. It's no wonder that we were kind of shiny. You know, none of us had sex for a decade. And and I just felt, you know, there's some kind of cage to this intensification that it is not properly integrated yet. And sure enough, a few years later, the whole thing just blew. It was like it really followed the myth of Camelot in many ways. You know, it blew, and the community went through this incredible, painful convulsion where several people disrobed. Monks and nuns were falling in love with each other and disrobing and running off to get married and stuff. And the pain of it was just incredible. But it was an initiation into, and it was an initiation actually from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, which is a deeper appreciation of the awakening process. And so that unconscious incompetence is sometimes described as the charismatic position, which is what we were in. We were really charismatic. I think we were sort of pissing people off as well. I just felt like everyone's pissed off because, you know, why are these guys more alive, looking more sort of like lit up than us? And it's because we were in this kind of unconscious incompetent stage. We certainly had access to, you know, we understood what awakened mind was, but we hadn't actually integrated it and humanized it and been humbled by it. So there was an arrogance and overconfidence, you know, that needed to get crushed, and it did. But that crushing was painful. And you know, and I've had marriages and things and divorces, and you know, lots of things have gone wrong in my life, like in anybody's life. And it's when I get crushed by something that is outside of my control that, in a sense, I'm given that opportunity to grow. And then you have to take it. It's not a given that you are going to grow, because you can just run down the pub and drink your way through it. You know,
Sure.
and then you won't grow. You only grow when you're prepared to be consciously present to dis-ease, to comfort. And then through the inquiry into that disease, you go from ignorance, which is experiencing the disease as that pain is just pain, you know, I've got to get rid of it, to, you know, and that's seeing it just on the surface, like I'm describing with the Vijja, just sees the singular dimension. Pain, go. Pain, got to kill it. Whereas when you see it with Vijja or knowledge, Avijja is ignorance, Vijja is knowledge or direct seeing. then it reveals multiple dimensions. The pain actually has a taste of freedom right in the heart of it. It's boundless as a sensation. It's completely boundless. It can, it can take you to stillness, because, there's stillness in that pain. And then that stillness is more real than the pain, so you start to notice that all these sort of shifts in consciousness. Again, you're beginning to see layers within layers within layers, as opposed to just the mono interpretation of pain as pain, and that's the skill you develop. And then you actually become you develop a kind of called virya, courage. You develop a sort of a lust for the challenge. Okay, bring it on, bring it on. You can literally go to the most painful memory that you could possibly have in your meditation practice, and just invoke the worst sensations you could possibly imagine, and then say, this is interesting. Normally I would run from this, but I actually finding that I can find a sense of real okayness even in the presence of that, and this is where you begin to discover you've got resources within that you perhaps never even imagined were there.
Yeah. And, one of the key things that I see happening today, especially in personal growth, personal development, self-improvement, self-help, is that people try to transcend their human experience without firstly fully embracing it. So it's like trying to climb a ladder without securing its base.
Absolutely.
Because the essence of true spiritual growth requires you to face your shadows, to acknowledge your pain, to navigate your emotions with compassion and an awakened awareness. And I was having this argument, discussion, it turned into a difference of opinion with someone, who was saying to me, no, I know hundreds of people who've kind of, hit the spiritual dimension and they've never addressed those things. And I thought to myself, well, that's the dark side of spiritual escapism and spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
Because only when you can only rise, in my view and my experience, is you can only rise to a higher state of consciousness with authenticity and integrity when you address those things, when you address when you acknowledge your pain, when you navigate your emotions with compassion and awakened awareness.
Yeah.
Because there's wisdom inside of those emotions. There's wisdom in that pain.
Yeah.
So rather than, trying to be someone holding two beach balls underwater, which is very tiring, and, suppressing and repressing pain, which we're taught to do. You have a headache, you take a pill.
Sure.
But it's about exposing ourselves to that pain. And I think it's only then we can start to ascend in consciousness.
Well, I agree totally. I mean, but it is true that it's very common to witness spiritual bypassing. It's very, very common to see spiritual teachers who are at this third stage initiation, which is unconscious incompetence, that charismatic position, because they've had a genuine experience, but they experience themselves as if they are gods almost, because with that grandiosity, you feel, that luminosity, and you can feel, I am the one. I really got it. I'm the one now. And this can be like this massive unintegrated shadow, as you say, remains unaddressed. Now, when I was at that stage and our community was at that stage, I actually noticed that where I was and where we kind of were as a community, it didn't feel like fully matured somehow. I mean, there was no shortage of amazing spiritual experiences going on, but somehow there was something I just felt there was something not right about where we were at, but I couldn't do anything about it until this underlying intelligence that was way beyond my capacity to orchestrate brought about this. Well, there's a saying, where there's a hole, the rhino horn will enter. So, where there is this unconsciousness, life will conspire to smash, blindside you in some way that you hadn't seen coming. Could be a death, a car crash, a divorce, a heartbreak of some sort, bankruptcy, whatever, but something significant can just like, oh shit, it's not that easy. This overwhelms your grandiosity, pops that bubble, and humanizes you, because suddenly you realize, I'm not as invincible, as impervious as I imagined at an earlier stage. So it is stage specific. It's not, if you see spiritually dissociated people, it's not definitive of where they may end up. You have to allow for it almost in a way. Now, if they meet the right person, I know I knew someone who was one of, you probably heard of Bhagwan Rajneesh.
Yeah.
So he was one of Bhagwan's right-hand men, one of his main trainers. And, he came to the monastery, and I mean, you've never met such an overconfident, grandiose, inflated guy. I mean, he thought he was like God's gift to the universe, and he was very, very smart, an incredible trickster. He thought the monks were pretty much all twats and idiots, but he kind of liked hanging out. And then he met this one monk called Kirisaru, who, is an extraordinary person. And Kirisaru was able to burst this bubble, and this guy became totally wedded to the monastic community for the gift that it gave him of having his bubble burst and helping humanize him and get off this high horse. So it can happen that way too. If you meet the right person and they have the right skills, they can also pop the bubble. But for me, it's mainly been life conspiring to pop my bubble. I'm not necessarily able to, as I say, orchestrate these things for myself. But I've learned to trust that life goes in these cycles, and you've probably experienced them yourself, where you have these moments where a kind of window opens and suddenly you glimpse dimensions.
Oh, definitely.
Possibilities that hadn't been accessible to you before. And when you're in that transformative space, then you have to take the opportunity through, then the thing that you need to take the opportunity is sila, is containment. You have to contain it, not run from it, not try to modify it, not trying to change it, not try to make it something other than it is, but actually let it do you instead of you react to it, and just let yourself be cooked. And so sila is, in a sense, symbolized by a meditation mat. It's just like, stay on your mat. Don't move. Don't go to the bottle. Don't go to the cake. Don't, jump to something else. Just stay with it and let that intensification run right through you.
I remember going on a 3-week retreat called the Art of Satipatthana.
Yeah.
And which, as you know, is mindfulness, and it was run by an elderly Buddhist teacher. He was called Roshi. And I turned up in my egoic structure, because I was really into form and weightlifting and wanting to go into the Olympics and be this guy who's strong and all the rest of it. And when I arrived, and it was in Wales, and it was in October, so it was very wet and it was cold. And I had to wear loose-fitting bottoms and a hara belt and nothing on my feet. And it was like being in a planned confinement in this container for 3 weeks. And I remember going up to see Roshi, and he was sitting on the floor, and his dog, his Irish setter, was on the sofa. And I thought that was very strange. I thought, shouldn't you be on the sofa and the dog on the floor? but no. And he said to me, you feel like you're strong. You think you are very strong. I said, well, yeah, I trained to be very strong. So he stands up effortlessly. Now, this is an 82-year-old man.
Yeah.
And he extends his arm like this, which I soon realized was called the unbendable arm.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I want you to bend, put all your force on my arm with everything you've got, all your weight. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I'm just going to break your arm.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I'd humor him.
Yeah.
So I stood up and I put all my weight, a slight weight on his arm. I just thought I'll just do a little bit because I might snap his arm. Because I was lifting some heavy duty weights. And I was very strong at 30 years of age.
Mm.
And so I started to sweat. And I started to put more force on because my ego's like, hey, you're not going to beat me. I got into the dualistic nature of win lose,
Mm-hmm.
gain loss. I'm going to make you wrong, so I'm right. And I carried on and carried on. And I literally was sweating buckets.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said to me was that he said, you think strength is in here, pointing to my bicep, but it's actually in here.
Mm.
And he sat down and I said, now what happens next? And he said, are you hungry? I said, yeah. He said, right, go and eat. I said, and what do we do after that? He said, you wash your bowl. And it was that sort of being present to the one thing that you were doing. And I learned so much about surrender and being on the mat because I had to get up 5 o'clock in the morning, go to the lake, wash all these meridian points with freezing cold water, barefoot, do slow walking in the grass, and where from my foot to my knee just froze. And he gave me tasks to do, like picking up these little tiny pebbles on the driveway and putting it in a bucket, which I saw no sense in.
Yeah, no,
But it was changing my neurology. It was changing my physiology. 45 minutes meditation in the morning, exercises, 45 minutes at lunchtime, and an hour in the evening. And every time I wanted to get off that mat, because my legs, I'd never been in that position in my life, and my legs were just, so tight.
You were muscled up.
I was muscled up, and he came along, and he was very funny. He came along, and with his hands behind his back, and he said, "Hey, laddie, legs hurting you, are they?" And I just thought, oh God, he made me mad. And then at one point, he made me pick up these huge paving stones and just carry them from point A to point B, and then from point B back to point A. And it just exhausted me. I thought, I'm going to keep going. I don't quit.
That's classic Zen.
Is it? Yeah, I'm not going to quit. I'm just not going to quit. So all these tasks, and people left. People just dropped out. But what it taught me was, it totally changed my life.
Great.
Because I learned the art of mindfulness and being present. But the work that had to be done was shedding many, many layers, many, many layers of what I thought I knew. And I know now science has backed up that when you look beyond the atom, the cells, the atoms, it's just energy. There's nothing, it's just energy.
That's true. Things only appear because of point of view. So you see your microphone because you're located in a particular position. So you see that microphone from the position you're in. But does that describe the microphone in its entirety? I mean, for example, you can't see the back of your head. So I can't see the back of my head. So there are multiple perspectives. We can see some things based on point of view, but we can't be everywhere at once simultaneously and see all points of view simultaneously. And there's an infinite number of points of view in relation to your body. I mean, if you were sitting in a middle of a big football stadium, everyone would see your body from a slightly different point of view. And each point of view is equally real as the other point of view. But what happens if you get to the point where you experience all points of view simultaneously? What happens is you experience it as light.
Mm.
Everything is fundamentally composed of light. It only emerges as seemingly solid because of point of view. But that point of view is not it. It's only a point of view.
And you're describing something that happened to me within those 3 weeks. Because when I left, I got into the car and I was in floods of tears.
Mm-hmm.
I just, there was a sort of a, I didn't want to leave. And there were teachers. There was a huge mansion. There were teachers, all kinds of teachers, shiatsu teachers, and Zen teachers and all the rest of it. But there was something about when I looked at a tree, there was a different kind of, it was an awakened awareness. It wasn't self-awareness
Yeah.
that is promulgated in sort of self-help. It was an awakened awareness.
Yeah.
And that tree was luminous.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
It's sort of, I could start to,
experience.
and I started to see the energy around people as well.
Yeah.
So there was something happening there through going through all that pain and this is why when you invest in yourself, you know, to the point where you start to take on contemplative practices, you know, and you start to reflect on things, it does give you a different perspective. And that must change your neurology.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I find life absolutely amazing now. I mean, it's incredible journey that I've been on. I don't in any way feel I'm anywhere close to the end of it, but I've seen many of these layers peel back. Because I've seen so many layers peel back, I know there's many more layers that are still going to peel back. But you just have to get on that right road. You know, you've got to establish that right view, that right understanding, because it doesn't necessarily just happen by accident. It happens because you get the foundations right, and then, you know, which is this contemplative inquiry based on the body, the sensations in the body, and then, you know, what those sensations take you to, which is a little bit more mysterious, which is, you know, unbound awareness, or awareness that binds into solidity, and then the breaking of that solidity then into an unbound experience, you know, and the noticing of how things become solid and then unbind. And then that takes you to enlightenment factors
And liberation, because you know, just another point that I just remembered was that I used to have very bad sciatica, and after those 3 weeks, or actually within the first week or so, completely disappeared. And I used to go to have chiropractic and all kinds of treatments and acupuncture, but just through sitting and through the slow walking and working through the body, I was healed.
You burn up karma. So you burn up you know, habits from the past that have become, you could say, encoded into your body, and sort of your body in a sense holds as patterns. You begin to burn them up, you know, and it's, you know, this is how to become enriched and grow up, and also approach old age and the dying process in a way that's, you know, makes sense of it, as opposed to it's just this kind of terrifying specter that you just kind of push away and ignore, because you can sense through this inclination, through this aging, and then as you age, you can sense this gradual transitioning from identification with form. In a sense, you're kind of growing more and more into being Holy Spirit, literally. Which is not to claim anything really, because it's everyone's birthright. It's just should be the way it is for the majority, and I feel compassion for those people who are not getting this and taking the opportunity. I wish I could do more to communicate what's possible. And, in terms of practicality, this is a practical tradition, and in a sense, sila samadhi panya. So this idea of just, containment precepts, ethical precepts, not stealing, not killing, not committing adultery, or, fucking up other people's relationships, not drinking, unfortunately for some, and not, doing things that make you dozy, doing things. So these are the basic sort of, and this is not even morality. We're not saying this makes you a bad person if you do this stuff. But what it's saying is you're missing an opportunity to confront your process, to confront the fact that, that feeling you have to go down the pub, for example, experienced in ignorance, it's solid. It's just, it's like, yeah, I want to go down the pub, I'm going down the pub. Whereas with the precept, if the precept then says you can't, or you should, or you shouldn't, it's just saying, okay, well, now I've got this feeling, now I'm interested in seeing what it really is, what's really in it. And then you've got this opportunity to remove that avijja and turn it into vijja, into knowing what that sensation is. And you can find incredible things in that sensation of wanting to go down the pub that way surpass any enjoyment you would actually get from drinking. So then doesn't mean to say you can't go down the pub and have a drink, but it means that when you do it, you're choosing to do it freely. If you see what I'm saying, you have the option of either doing it or not doing it.
Yeah. Are you just, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you describing the nature of consciousness and how it relates to teachings on contemplation or on contemplative practices?
Yeah.
Okay.
The whole thing is you've got to challenge your states. You've got to challenge your moods. You've got to challenge your desire. Desire is a proxy for not being awakened. If you look, your Buddha statue in a sense represents your potential, an unrealized potential. And, walk up to Buddha statue and say, hey, do you want a beer? See how it feels. It's like, hey, I my boss was rude to me. I feel so upset. See how it feels. There's this thing within us that can accommodate all the winds of change while remaining serene. And that Buddha statue reflects it back to us, and it's free from need. It's like the Buddha statue, it's there when you leave the house and it's there when you come back. It's free from need. It doesn't need to do all the stuff that we are getting up to. It still remains serene. In a sense, of course, it's ridiculous in a way because it's a statue, but nevertheless, it's representing a potential. I mean, Bodhidharma sat in front of a wall for 12 years before he met the Emperor of China, so it can be done. His level of well-being and fulfillment was so complete that he didn't need anything other than staring at a wall. So that potential exists within us. It's just unrealized. So how do you realize it? You realize it through restraining all the stuff we get up to that's misguided, and challenging the impulse to do those things, and then investigating those misguided impulses to the point that you find the intrinsic freedom within them. And that's essentially what a monastery represents. What when I first arrived at the monastery at the age of 22, I was used to like Friday night, hit the town, Saturday night, great,
Paint it red. Yeah.
paint it red. And our monastery, the monastery where I ordained, was just outside of Newcastle. So on top of a hill, I could see Newcastle at the weekends. And I can remember doing like walking meditation and like 8 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday night. It's just like, this is insane. You can feel the sort of the wild energy kind of rising like vapor out of Newcastle. And Newcastle is a town where people enjoy the nightlife. You could
tanked.
Yeah, totally. You could really feel it was happening. There was I as a 22-year-old doing walking meditation on a Saturday night. Constrained. I was utterly constrained, so then had it not been for that discipline, I would have been in town. I mean, but I didn't have the option of doing that. So my only other option was then to start to release that feeling of imprisonment through consciousness. It was intensified. The fact that I wanted to go into town on Saturday night, and that was my habit, became incredibly obvious because I could feel it, the pool, but I couldn't follow the pool. My only option was to keep walking up and down that path, staying with that pool. And that burning was not comfortable, but it was burning. And if you stay with it, like a fire that burns its fuel, eventually that fuel burns up. Eventually the habit burns up. What remains when the habit burns up? Saturday night on the meditation path, feel what's happening in Newcastle, and then the mind just doesn't move. It's just like, there's full contentment where I am. I don't need to modify the situation. That's what remains.
Well, it can become a living fire that fuels a very different kind of energy in your system.
Yeah. So, and there's many moods and things like that exist in us of all sorts of different types. And basically we've got to take them all to nirvana, take them all, which is cool. We've got to cool them all by burning them up through, not because there's anything wrong with them, but we're interested in releasing the multi-layered quality that gives us access to many more dimensions and layers of enrichment than we would otherwise get through just grabbing onto the surface appearance and being, persuaded that that's the only truth. We have to follow it. So it's all about challenging what we want. It's all about being able to challenge it. And then in the challenging, you create this crucible. And then if you hold, if you want a cup of coffee in the morning, and then I say you can't have that cup of coffee, you do have the option of just feeling how pissed off you are about not getting what you want, and then just staying with it and turning it into an inquiry and seeing, well, now I've got the option of perhaps of releasing it through consciousness. I mean, Ajahn Cha, who was the sort of source teacher of my tradition, I wasn't subjected to this. He could get away with it because he was such a powerful teacher. People would put up with this. But this is something he used to do to his disciples. They would be sitting on a concrete floor at maybe 2 a.m, and there would be some hot bubbling tea bubbling away that he wasn't letting them, giving them access to. And he'd be making them listen to old tapes of his talks. And then the batteries would run out and they'd start fiddling with the batteries and stuff and everything. And everyone's sitting there on this hard floor. It was kind of a form of torture, basically. He was pushing till their minds, your mind can literally explode with passionate pissed offness. But if you're training as a monk with Ajahn Cha in this formal setting, what can you do? You're trapped. You're pinned. The only thing you can do is let it rip right through you and just burn and burn. And Ajahn Cha did this to his students. And, eventually it cools down until you reach the point where, you're not futuring, you're not othering, you're not looking for something other than this. Whereas that's what we're up to the majority of the time. We think, my life needs more than this. Got to add, got to add, got to add something more.
Yeah,
Constantly.
and it's not so much, something I tell my clients is that it's not so much what you can add to your life, it's more what you can subtract from your life.
Yeah.
And it's this the emphasis is on subtraction and peeling the layers off rather than wanting and adding, because some people make their lives about making money and adding more money, and even when they've got their first million or 10 million, they want another 10 million, which they can't even spend, or they do spend, but then they want more and more. And I've had clients who are like that, where they're just on this treadmill are wanting more and more and more, and they don't need more and more and more, but they feel they need to have more and more of it. And that's the way our society is set up, is that it's, in terms of consumerism and in terms of wanting more. But actually, and this is something I found, and that 3-week experience made me realize that actually I didn't need all the things that I need. And as I've got older, I'm more interested in letting go
That's
of
why
many aspects of things. And that form of torture that you described, I remember, it just brings to mind when I was involved in Olympic weightlifting. My coach at the time, who was in his 60s, used to train to the point of failure. And you would be at the point where you're throwing up or you pass out, and he would come with smelling salts and say, get back up and get back under the iron. And you were so pissed off with him. But what happened was that he saw the potential in you to go beyond, to transcend beyond what you thought you were capable of.
So that is the training as a monastic and as a human being, ultimately, is to learn to let all things pass through you freely without resistance, no matter what. So for example, I think it was about my 10th year or something, I remember some very arrogant Spanish person visited the monastery and said some very unpleasant things to me in a formal setting with other people around. And I actually went blind with anger. It's the first time I was able to let, I must have reached the point where I was so angry, my eyes couldn't see. It just went right, because it rose right up through my body.
Blind with rage.
Blind with rage. And I was just, no one probably would have known, because I was just sitting there like this. But it burnt right through me. And I thought, well, that isn't, that's, to me, that's an attainment, to be able to let that happen, not just be a nice person, or whatever, to actually let that pass through me. And in Zen, in the Zen herding pictures, they have this whole imagery of the bull, because there is this incredibly powerful instinctual energy in all of us. And how we can learn to draw on its power while staying human is really the whole process of individuation. That's what individuation is how to be present to these enormous archetypal forces that are in our psyche, and they are there. If you're not depressed, which is just one way of avoiding being responsible to them. How to draw on these forces while at the same time staying human. So you get this ego self axis. So this universal self and your human self, in a sense, are appropriately aligned. Now, if you get too close, you're going to become the next Messiah and become a real pain in the ass. You think you're the second coming. If you don't get close enough, then you will feel depressed and depleted, and that your life isn't amounted. You're not realizing your potential. So the trick is to get that right distance where you can sip on the fuel, but not be burnt up by it like Icarus.
What advice would you give to someone who's interested in exploring contemplative studies or meditation, but isn't sure where to start?
Yeah, it's tricky. Just, well, start reading. You know, I found the classics quite good, like what the Buddha taught and stuff like that. Really quite traditional uh, texts that kind of got me orientated, certainly to the Theravada tradition. I mean, it's not entirely straightforward because I don't actually necessarily even agree with how the tradition has been taught, even by monastics. So, your audience should be aware that I have a particular take on things. But, you have to just follow your instincts. You have to find your affinity, basically, and follow that and trust that. It's not really for me to say which tradition or which teacher you should go to, but, trust your bullshit detector, because there is quite a bit of bullshit. Even that's maybe okay, because if you start with some bullshit, eventually you realize it's bullshit and you move on, and it was a stepping stone to something else. So,
well, sometimes you need to know what bullshit is in order to know what it isn't.
I
What
mean,
isn't bullshit.
I love this tradition that I mean, I'm an interpreter. I'm not a literalist. Don't get me wrong. I don't like have this like Theravada stamp on my forehead. I'm very much an interpreter, very much incorporated a lot of Jungian psychology as well into my understanding.
I noticed when you said individuation and
Yeah. So,
so how do you see the practice of contemplation and meditation evolving in the future?
I just see it as an absolute imperative. I mean, if you're a human being with a body, then you want to know what it is. I mean, if you don't know who you are, then what do you know? If you don't know what's actually going on, what do you know? You don't know nothing. You don't know shit.
Mm.
And it's just unbelievable in a way that we know so little about, if I say to you, well, where are you located inside of your body? You don't know where that is, and you don't know what the meaning of that absence might be. But if you're honest about it, we're operating out of complete assumption that the I that we assume to be I is actually an I, when it in fact isn't, and it's undiscoverable, and that's totally obvious.
Well, it's interesting how we issue a singularity into a multiplicity.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Not thought of that one before.
Mm.
So,
look,
and we just, so I mean, sorry, but I mean, we crave heartfulness. We crave it, and I do want to emphasize that this is a tradition of the heart, because, as these things are realized, the heart awakens. And when the heart awakens, then it feels full of these immeasurables, we call it metta. There are these four immeasurables they call metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. That is compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These are, in a sense, the ground of the being of the source condition. These are the responses that we as human beings would have in response to conditions when we are aligned with that source condition, and that fills our heart. And it's the royal marriage then between form and emptiness. That royal marriage then is continuously and forever enriching us, and then that liberates us and others from all sorts of bullshit that we get up to.
That's beautiful. Any last words at all, Mahesi? Because I feel like we could just continue.
Yeah, I mean, we've not even touched
dialogue.
teach us some about it, but that would take us be another hour.
Well, you can come back, and because there's a lot I'd like to uncover and reveal about these practices, and your interpretation of it, because I've listened to lots of Pema Chodron, and I love her way and style, because the way that she explains it and interprets it. I don't know if she's from this tradition.
She's tradition, but I know of her.
Yeah, and she talks a lot about equanimity and some of the things that you talked about. So, any last words at all?
Well, my wish for everybody is that they can find some pathway to, building the basic foundations for a contemplative life, which are generosity, basic morality, basic ethical parameters, not just so you're a good person, but because you have the curiosity to see what keeping certain parameters invokes, induces your experience, so that when you don't, or resist doing or following the impulse that you want to follow, that impulse then becomes a contemplative object. You're curious to understand, well, what is that impulse really about, instead of just resisting it, not learning anything from it other than, being a stoic, which is not really what it's about. It's about increasing sensitivity, not just holding oneself rigidly through the use of form. And then, spend more time in nature and just, let things impact you. Let nature impact you, and let the mind fall into not knowing. Don't try to always name everything, know what's going on. Teach thy tongue to say, I do not know, and thou shalt progress.
Well, I always think labels are for the lost.
Yeah.
Like titles.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of, we're not going into Paticca Samuppada, but that is part of the Paticca Samuppada sort of pattern name, divide in knowing, name and form. It creates these heaps of solidity all around us. But when they cease, then that solidity breaks down, and we're then much more into the Holy Spirit that imbues all things, and it's much more fluid and mysterious, but amazing and fulfilling, and it's never the same thing twice, so there's boredom.
You can't step into the same river twice.
No, that's exactly.
Thank you so much, Mahesi, for your time and your energy and your insights. It's been really an honor and a privilege to speak with you.
Sure.
And I think it may continue. This is just a pause continuance.
Yeah, you're great to talk to. And honestly, I've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things I would have wanted to share, but wasn't.
Well, maybe we can do a series.
Yeah. There is one thing I wanted to share that's very, very brief, that will be useful for your clients, useful for you as a standard. It's called the 4 requisites, the 4 things you need for a happy life. So it gives a standard against which you can judge all the other stuff that you think you need. And it's clothes. You need clothes to cover your body. You need food for one day. You don't need a whole storeroom of food, because you'll find food the next day. You need shelter for one day, because if you have to move on, someone else will give you shelter. You just need shelter for the night. And you need medicine for the body, which could be plants, water, simple things. And that's it. That's the standard. Anything over and above that is excess, not required for happiness and well-being. In order to access happiness and well-being, you do need those 4 things. But that's all.
That's great. Thank you, Mahesi.
Yeah. Okay.